Zuzana. You are a Czech-American filmmaker born in Prague into a secular Jewish upper-class, close-knit and loving family in an enlightened Prague milieu. Upon the Nazi invasion of 1939, your childhood is shattered and you become a victim of Nazi harassment, persecution, and destruction. All your family is deported to Theresienstadt, a Nazi concentration camp northwest of Prague, where you managed to survive 2 horrific, inhuman years. Unfortunately, your father, Viktor Pick, is murdered in Auschwitz. As Shoah survivors, you and your mother become refugees and leave Czechoslovakia for Argentina in 1948, while your older brother, Jiří Robert Pick, J.R. Pick, stays in Prague, emerging in the 50s as a successful satirical author. 2 years later, you come to the US on your own to attend Vassar College, earning a BA in Russian, and later Columbia University, receiving a PhD in Slavic linguistics. During your graduate studies, you become a mother and work as a writer, researcher, and translator. Later, you boldly decide to embark on a different journey and become a professional filmmaker, your inspiration remaining deeply rooted in your Czech past, what is called in Czech zázemí, not only as a witness, but as an acute listener and eager voice giver. You transmit testimonies and lessons of Czechoslovak history, building beyond the horror and destruction of the Shoah and the scars and murders of Nazism and communism. You have found the language to construct a woman's narrative and build a legacy of truth based upon intimate and powerful testimonies, establishing a labor of memory and a distinctive voice.
Helena, thank you very much for your extremely kind words, so beautifully expressed. And thank you, Chris and SVU, for inviting me. And I would also like to thank the Society for the History of Czechoslovak Jews, of which I am a proud board member, for co-sponsoring this event.
Thank you. So in a few moments, we're going to show some clips from Zuzana's films. And Helena and I will take turns asking a follow-up question. I know that you in the audience will have your own questions about the films, but I would ask you to hold them towards the end of the program, and we'll have a general Q&A at the very end. We wanted to try and keep things moving along as we go from clip to clip, but do keep those questions in mind to bring at the end. So before we show the first film clip, I just wanted to ask you, Zuzana, you and I are graduates of the same department. We both studied Slavic languages. And I still haven't made the transition to filmmaking. Can you say just a little bit about what it was that drew you to this activity and helped you feel ready to take it on?
Well, you haven't made the transition because you have a job. And after many years of graduate study, I had a degree in linguistics, but I should really explain that in the very early 60s, I was fluent in Russian. And at that time, I was living in Houston, Texas. But just before I left, I was offered a teaching job of teaching Russian at a very good high school in Houston by the principal on the phone, sight unseen. There were people who were so desperate to find Russian professors, the Russian teachers. But I left Houston at that time and I embarked on my graduate work at Columbia, first in Russian literature and then in Slavic linguistics. And I had many leaves of absence, because of my family responsibilities. And when I finally got my degree, many, many, many years later, there were absolutely no jobs in New York. And that's when I decided to make films.
Okay. Well, I just want to introduce the first film that we're going to see a clip from. This is Voices of the Children from 1996. This film is the story of 3 people who were deported to Terezín at the age of 12. They all kept diaries and drew pictures in these diaries, and they all went on to Auschwitz and to other camps. The film also deals with their lives after the war and with the effect of the Holocaust on them and on their families. Helga Hoskova became an artist, Michael Kraus, an architect, and Helga Kinski, who was a gifted artist as a child, did not pursue a profession because she devoted herself to the care of her daughter, Eva, who was born deaf. So we'll now roll a clip from Voice of the Children and come back for a follow-up question.
Maminka kolíbá děťátko houpiho, myslí si, co bude, až děti vyrostou. Každý koz ze hnízda jedenkrát vyletá, musí pryč, neví proč, odletí do světa. Maminko, kdyby se dneska nás viděla.
This is a modern production of a children's opera called Brundibar. It has a special meaning for me. I saw it for the first time more than 50 years ago in Terezín, a Czech town which became a concentration camp for Central European Jews. Brundibar was staged for the thousands of children in the camp by Terezín artists and musicians. They try to protect us by helping us escape into a special world of art and imagination. I was brought to Terezín when I was 11, and now I've come back to the Czech Republic to tell the story of the Terezín children. I asked 3 Terezín friends to let me film the stories of their lives and the war experiences that shaped them.
This top book is my current diary, and you can see here these 3 piles here are over 50 years of keeping diaries. This is now invaluable because as my memories fade, this becomes an important reminder without which I would be totally lost about the past. It's only about 10 years ago that I became interested anew in our past and became to regret that I don't remember. And this quest for recreating the past still continues.
Náš život má někde přelom a my jsme ten život se rozdělil na to, co bylo. A my do dneška říkáme, a to jiní lidi neříkají, to jsem si uvědomila, my vždycky říkáme před válkou a po válce. To byl jiný život, který tam někde zůstal, protože tam zůstali naše příbuzní, zůstali tam přátelé, zůstalo tam vlastně všechno, co patřilo k světu, který skončil.
As a witness and victim of the Shoah, can you tell us how you decided to give voice to others?
Well, my first film also deals with Terezín. It's called Terezín Diary. And I didn't suggest that we include it. I'm not completely happy with it. It was my first attempt, and I was not the director. I was the executive producer and writer. I did all the interviews, and but I really had no experience in making films, and I had a collaborator, and it was a very difficult collaboration. And I was not happy with the film. I actually, about 10 years ago, I re-edited it a little bit and took out some of the things that I really didn't like. But I told you that I'd spent all that time in graduate school and then I didn't have a job, and I decided to start making films. And in 1986, in the summer, my mother always spent her summers in Prague to be close to my brother. And I told her that I was thinking about making a documentary about the Terezin children. I always loved film. And when I watched documentaries, which I did a lot, I said to myself that maybe I could do this. And I told my mother to maybe find me someone in Prague to do research. And she called me in the middle of the summer, and she told me that for the first time, the communists permitted the Terezin children to have a reunion. And this was, 86 under communism. And I took it as a sign of fate. And it was in the summer, and I called a woman I was friendly with who had a very important job at Channel 13. And I told her about my idea, and I thought that she would say, well, let's have lunch sometime. But she said, oh, this is a wonderful idea. Can I come right over? Mm-hmm. And that's how it all started. And she put me together with this collaborator. And then my filmmaking job began. What did you ask me?
So how did you decide? I'm sorry. How did you decide to give voice to others? It's more about the others than about you.
When I show these films, they always ask me why I didn't include myself, because I'm certainly not in Terezin Diary, and also not in Voices of the Children. Terezin Diary was, the story of the children is included, but it was pretty much a history of Terezin. But the Voices of the Children, I chose the three people that are in the film because it's a documentary. I wanted to document as much as possible. And all three kept diaries, and all three made drawings. And I did that too, but I didn't have as big a diary as they did. And also, I wanted them to be typical of Terezin children. And most Terezin children went to Auschwitz. And as you probably know, most of them perished. And I was fortunate enough to remain in Terezin until the end of the war. So I was not really a typical child. So that's why I didn't include myself and let other people speak for me.
Okay, thank you.
But maybe I can just say a few words about this excerpt. Helga Hošková, the artist, was just 90 years old, and she has a big exhibit in Prague. Oh, nice. And Misha Kraus sadly died about a year ago. And Helga Kinski lives in Vienna, and she's well. And her daughter, who's in the film, and she, we just showed you the beginning, but she speaks. She's extremely intelligent, and even though she's deaf, she speaks quite well. But she had a cochlear implant a few years ago, and she's now hearing.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
I will now introduce the second movie. A Trial in Prague is about the Slansky trial, in which 14 leading communists were tried for treason and espionage and were convicted on the basis of forced confessions. Though some of them may have been guilty of other crimes, they were innocent of these charges. Of the 14, 11 were hanged, and of the 14, 11 were Jews. The widows of 3 of the men who were executed testify. The men were Otto Schling, Artur London, and Rudolf Margolius. We also hear from Eduard Goldstucker, a diplomat and Kafka scholar who was a trial witness and was jailed, and Jan Kavan, a former Czech foreign minister whose father was also imprisoned In this segment of the film, witnesses try to explain what led them to their beliefs in communism. Do you feel that women's attitudes towards gender roles have changed today in the Czech Republic?
Oh, well, when I made the film, I made it about 20 years ago. And I've pretty much stopped going to the Czech Republic. I'm sorry, but probably many people here know much more about that than I do. I hope they changed.
Maybe that's a question that we can leave to the
Later.
audience later. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay, then another question. How did you find all the different characters that you have in your
Well,
film?
I was after '89, the end of the communist regime. I spent a lot of time in Czechoslovakia, not working on films, but also I was very involved with the Prague Jewish community and the Terezín Museum and Memorial. Under communism, there was no museum in the ghetto itself. And after '89, the Czech government was very supportive of founding a museum there, but there were no funds. And I knew a little bit about fundraising. I had to when I was making films. So I was trying to help. And I worked together with them. At that time, as you probably know, there were many young Americans in Prague. And one of those, Jody Becker, a young reporter, was living in Prague. And she was helping me with the fundraising. And we were always comparing notes about Czech women and their negative attitudes to feminism. And then I decided to make this film. And I asked Jody to work with me. And she was, I was in New York and she was living there. I asked her for a preliminary search of these women. And she, unfortunately, didn't speak Czech, but she worked with a wonderful Czech reporter, Lenka Studničková, now Lenka Rubinstein. And Lenka was responsible for finding most of the women. And for instance, we don't show Mohoritova. Mohoritova. I have the wife of a former big shot communist, Mohorita. And so Lenka happened to work with her, and she told me about Pavla Slaba. And I don't know if Pavla is that well known and
She used to be. It used to be a very popular rock group. Yeah.
And so that's how I found the women. And actually, one of them, the woman who works at Škoda, she's quite amazing. I think she's so articulate. She says she never went to school, but she's extremely articulate in Czech. And a friend of mine who was head of the unions for a very short time after '89, because he was active in the so-called revolution. He introduced me to her.
Thank you.
Right. So it's actually been a little while since you made the most recent of these films, which was The Trial in Prague. But you haven't been exactly inactive since then. I know there's been a number of really remarkable projects that you have brought to fruition in the new millennium. And I wonder if you could tell us a little about some of those things. I know that a couple of those have to do with bringing some of your brother's work to an English language audience, including your work translating and producing his play, The Unlucky Man in the Yellow Cap, in the 2006 New York International Fringe Festival. And then there was his book, which came out in 2018 in Alex Zucker's fine translation, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about those two projects, why you chose them, and what was involved in getting them going.
Well, The Unlucky Man in the Yellow Cap takes place in Terezin, and it has humor and it has music. It's a play with music. And my brother wrote satirical poems, but he really started out writing lyric poetry, and he wrote lyrics for some popular Czech songs. And so I thought that this play about that has a love story and music could be produced here. And I translated it, but Alex Zucker had a part in that because he edited my translation. Edited means improved. And so we had a short run at the Fringe Festival in New York. And as far as the translation of his book, Spolek pro ochranu zvířat, Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, that is my brother's book about Terezin, written in 1969. It's among his best works, I think, and it's based on his life in a hospital, tuberculosis hospital in Terezin. But the central character, my brother was 6 years older than I was, so he was a teenager. But the main character in the book is a young boy, Tony, and the book has humor, and it came out in 1969, has been reissued 4 times in Prague. No, excuse me, reissued 3 times, but I couldn't find a publisher willing to publish this book because it's about the Holocaust and it has humor. But finally, Alex, who's I think sitting over there, and did a wonderful translation, which is probably very difficult to translate in this book, found me a publisher. It is Carolinum Press, the publishing house of Charles University. And it came out last year and had a wonderful review in the Los Angeles Review of Books. And I'm not sure how it's selling. One of my sons always asking me how it's selling, but I haven't checked lately. I'm sure it will never be a bestseller, but I'm very happy that it finally was published in English. It came out in Germany 5 years ago, and had a most wonderful review and Die Welt, and they used the word genius. Yeah.
I'm going to have a question about the stage reading of your play, Waiting for Father, that I'm sure a lot of people here have seen last November, right, 2018. The question is very simple. Why did it take you so long to write such a play?
Well, I was busy making films. And before that, I was busy studying linguistics. But I, when we put on my brother's play, one of the actors, who was also a director and had a lot of experience, suggested that I make some additions because to explain what the play, the background of the play. And I found myself adding some dialogue, and I discovered I really liked writing dialogue. And then I had a lot of family responsibilities at that time. My husband was not well, so everything took me a long time. But I did manage to write this play, which is partly based on my life and had a stage reading in this building.
So the most recent project that a lot of us here know you for is this article published just this past September in the New Yorker with the title "My Terezín Diary," which kind of brings us right back to the topic from the beginning of our program. And again, I guess sort of a similar question about why this comes now. Is it just because this is when there was time for it, or were there other things that prompted you to write this piece and to find a forum like the New Yorker to publish it?
Well, I actually wrote this piece 7 or 8 years ago, and it was in my drawer. But my brother, who was a writer, took 20 years to write about Terezín. And some people take a long time, and some people never write anything. So when I stopped making films, and I had to because I was taking care of my husband, and also I got older, and making films requires a lot of energy, mental and physical, but mainly physical. No, both. But and I met someone, a very fine writer, about a year ago, and she asked me if I had ever written anything about Terezín, and asked me to send it to her, and she liked it, and she sent it on to the New Yorker.
Well, thank you so much for that piece. I think a lot of us enjoyed that, and I think it brought us, for me anyway, brought me into that experience in a way that a lot of other writings on it had not.
Thank you.
So I think maybe now we could
open the floor
to questions from our audience. I have an extra microphone.
Thank you very much, Zuzana. This was wonderful to see somebody who is keeping the image of the horrible situation. I am myself a child of Holocaust survivors, and so for me it was very personal. But this leads me to the question: what do you think about the recent rise of anti-Semitism and hatred all around the world that is happening again?
Well, I'm horrified, and I wish we could do something about it, but I don't have any ideas. I mean, it's not just anti-Semitism, but there's so much hatred.
Thank you very much for your contributions. In your interviews with the survivors of the Slansky trials, was there a recalibration of their view of their views towards communism and the reasons for joining in light of what happened both at the time of the trial and of course what followed and preceded it, that changed history?
All the people that I spoke with were very much left-wing, but I don't think they were communists anymore. And we spoke mostly about, when I interviewed them, we spoke mostly about the past. And I tried to put them at ease. And I did not speak to them about their present views, really. When I interviewed Mrs. London, the French woman, she was very suspicious of me because an article, a Czech historian had written an article accusing her husband of his, saying that when he fought in Spain, he worked for the KGB, for the Russian Secret Service. And she was she was probably a bit of a suspicious person anyway. So it was very difficult for me to gain her trust, even though I was referred to her by a friend of one of her children.
Are you familiar with this volume?
I can't see.
Are you familiar with this volume?
In Memory's Kitchen.
Oh, yes. I think it was very popular some time ago. It's a book of recipes, is that? Yeah, yeah.
Smuggled from Terezin.
Yes, yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what it was like for you to go back to Terezin. And I ask this question because I know Holocaust survivors that would never even go back to their home country, let alone go back to their concentration camp.
Well, I think it was not that difficult for me to go back because I went back with my mother and my brother. And had I gone back alone, I think it would have been very difficult. But when I made my first film, Terezin Diary, filming the reunion of the Terezin children, I was on the bus. We took a bus from Prague to Terezin, and that's how I met Helga Kinski, who's in Voices of the Children and who was also in my first film. I think most of the people on the bus were very emotionally upset. It was very difficult for them. Some of them were crying, and it was much easier for me because it wasn't the first time, and the first time I went back was with my family.
Are your films available on Netflix or any of the television channels that show
Hi,
film?
Sue.
Hi.
Sue is a distributor, so she has that. Well, my films, A Drown in Prague and Voice of the Children, are on Amazon. And my distributor is the Cinema Guild.
What struck me with all three movies that you made, they all are dealing with victims. Obviously, the movie about Trade Shot, these were the victims' children. Even the Slansky trial, we're talking about victims that may have been very unflattering, but they were victims. And of course, the last movie, which was the first one in your direction, deals with women who are also victims. Is it because you find the idea of giving the voice to victims more interesting, or is it just coincidental that all of the movies deal with victims?
Well, I beg to disagree. I don't think my film about the women was about victims.
We haven't seen
there are
enough
some
of it.
very strong women in that film. I unfortunately, when my films deal with some events in the history of Czech Jews, and these were tragic events. So that would be the reason why you would call the characters that I interview victims. But I think I don't think that I concentrate on their victimhood, and I sometimes show the strength with which they dealt with their histories. But the women certainly are not victims.
Yes, I've seen Voices of the Children a few times. First time I met you actually at the Alliance Française, I remember. Brought my children
I remember.
there. Yes, and on Channel 13. And I've seen the trial in Prague. I think when you first were showing in New York, it seems to me a long, long time ago.
It was about 19 years ago, yeah.
Big space, but I can't remember where.
Yeah, 2000.
I would like to disagree with this gentleman. I think the first Voices of the Children is about victims, obviously, of the horrible Nazi regime, first of all. The second one, I think it's about mostly victimizers. There was a big controversy at the movie. I remember people were jumping up. Some of us immigrants protesting against this movie because many of us, including me, believe that a good communist is a dead communist. I was born in 1951 into deep Stalinism, into a very anti-communist family. So we really had our share of hell. in in that. And so I don't think these people are victims. They were maybe victims through the anti-Semitism, but they were victimizers. What do you think about this statement? And the third film I would like to see still by the women, and I have my own opinion, but I don't want to say just my opinions. I like to hear you.
There were 14 people. 14 people were on trial, and each had a different story. And some of them committed terrible deeds, but not all. And as I mentioned, Margolius was definitely not someone who committed crimes. Yeah.
If you want to look for some theme that unites Zuzana's work, I think what attracts her and what attracts me and other people are the unexamined issues in the Czech society and from the Czech history. Because Czechoslovakia was just out of commission. I mean, these issues were never discussed till 1989. So issues of, for instance, of survivors, issues of families that were destroyed, it was always pushed into the background for a very long time. And in the same way, issues about who was a communist, how guilty was he, what happened to these people, it's an issue that was not discussed in open society. It was discussed among us, but we didn't know the answers. And I don't think the trial in Prague is really about who was guilty and who was not guilty, but what really happened with these people. How did they form their attitudes? What happened to the families that were around them? I am also from a very anti-communist family, but I never doubted that these people essentially were idealists and had a vision of a future that unfortunately was not terribly realistic and that turned into a terror. But they were decent people, many of them.
I have to thank you, Milena. I have to mention that when because you said that I cover subjects that have not, that I have dealt with subjects that have not necessarily been dealt with in Czechoslovakia and now in the Czech Republic. When I finished a trial in Prague in 2000, Czech TV turned it down. And they eventually showed it, but they turned it down. And it was the first time that it was really dealt with.
And in the same way, when you think about the film that is somewhat different, and somebody called about victims, the film about the women, again, those issues were not discussed. It was always somehow deflected. I can tell you that Czech women till now, older women, never say they are feminists. And I always say, I'm 84 and I was a feminist from the time I was born. But a Czech woman never says it because they feel it's not sexy. No,
Yeah,
well,
it's a dirty word to be a feminist in the Czech Republic, right?
You know, funny world, but it's an interesting world.
Chris.
Okay. I think we'll have to wrap up our questions. Thank you, all of you, for coming, and please give a warm hand to Zuzana.
Thank you. And I just like to say one thing. Thank you very much for coming. And I see many faces from the IRP, that's the Institute for Retired Professionals, and you, of which I'm a member. And you're probably here for the first time in this building. And we have many interesting programs, and you can leave your email on a list outside. Thank you.
Thank you.